Hello everyone, I'm Queen Kimmy. Grab your PDAs, grab your scanners, and let's talk about Alterra from Subnautica, the corporation that somehow managed to become your employer, your landlord, your debt collector, and your government all at the same time. I will be delving into different corporations, organizations, and governments from our favorite video game worlds. We'll go into how they're structured, what they do, and where life starts to imitate art a little too closely. I'll connect in the real-world examples, explore the administrative logic behind their decisions, and with typical video game storytelling, why these corporations are usually absolutely terrible. Welcome to Policy in Pixels. We first met the Altera Corporation in 2018 with the release of the best-selling indie game, Subnautica. Its lore explained further into later titles like Below Zero. To understand what Altera is now and what it's trying to do, we need to start with its past, and of course, spoilers for Subnautica and Below Zero. Altera's history. The company Altera was an American company that took its name from the Latin roots of alt, or altus for high, and terra for earth. Although we do not have an exact year that Altera was founded, we can assume that it happened after humanity's expansion to the stars in the mid-22nd century. Altera began as a weapons company, and they made their name by selling to pretty much anyone who showed up with money. That worked out fine until a full-scale war broke out, and Altera kept selling to every faction involved. As the company expanded its factories and influence, each army grew more dependent on Altera's weapons. That dependence gave Altera leverage. One day they warned all sides that they would stop selling if the fighting continued. The war ended nearly overnight. That sounds ridiculous, right? Unfortunately, the real-world weapons trade isn't nearly far from the scenarios we'd like to pretend. In researching this video, I came across numerous real-world examples where weapons manufacturers sold to multiple sides of the same conflict. For my own well-being, I'm not going to name specific companies. Instead, what matters here is not who did it, but how it was allowed to happen. To understand that, we need to look at how weapons manufacturing and export policies are supposed to function during wartime, and how often those rules are bent. The United Nations is made up of 193 member states and defines itself as the one place on Earth where world's nations can gather together, discuss common problems, and find shared solutions that benefit all of humanity. One of those shared problems is preventing weapons manufacturers from selling arms in situations where there is a high risk of human rights abuse. In response to this concern, the Arms Trade Treaty was established in December of 2014. Its purpose is straightforward on paper, to require governments to take responsibility for whether weapons produced by companies within their borders should be exported to conflicts where those weapons could be used to commit serious human rights violations. So, in theory, this should help. Well, out of 193 members of the United Nations, only 130 signed it into place as United Nations Treaty, and only 116 members ratified it in their own countries, which means they are legally bound to it. Do you want to guess who hasn't ratified it?
Some of us, I don't want to name names, make pretty bad throat noises when they drink, and it makes me think that the throat is...
Is it me?
No.
Is it me?
It's not Travis.
Yeah, so the United States has not ratified and may never ratify the Arms Trade Treaty, and has openly said as much. In 2019, the United States informed the Secretary General of the UN the following. This is to inform you, in connection with the Arms Trade Treaty done at New York on April 2nd, 2013, that the United States does not intend to become party to the treaty. Accordingly, the United States has no legal obligations arising from its signature on September 25th, 2013. The United States does not rely on the Arms Trade Treaty to regulate weapons export. Instead, it uses domestic laws like the Arms Export Control Act and the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or as known, ITAR, which control how weapons are sold, but give the government broad discretion over whether they are sold even in active conflicts with human rights violations. So maybe that's why Altera is based in America. It makes a lot more sense. Moving on from the war, we come to space travel! Humanity has reached the stars and expanded the universe through the use and discovery of phase gates. All these planets with no life, ready for human colonization and business. But here's the problem. While nations might afford a planet or two, who could possibly fund the colonization and refinement of entire solar systems? Damn it. Let's talk about trans governments. And thus planetary systems, scale corporations, and the idea of transgovs were formed. Transgovs are described in the database of Subnautica as an independent authority in de facto control of at least one solar system. A quick note: in any governing body that met the definition could declare itself a transgov. There are 4 known transgovs, including Altera, the Mongolian independent states, the Sol transgov, a small unnamed transgov in the Andromeda galaxy, as well as 33 others we don't know. We really only have information about Altera and the Mongolian independent states, however. Altera is known as the most profitable, the biggest, and most definitely the strongest of all the transgovs. So when Altera went to space and became a trans government with domination over multiple solar systems, what exactly did they do with that power? From what we understand, they reside over many solar systems that are based and run as corporate-owned and supervised workplaces with homes, local governments, and societies. However, they have stood by the fact that they do not claim the title of a government and only claim the title of a corporation. The interesting idea of a corporation owning a solar system and being responsible for all the lives on it seems far-fetched, but in reality there have been many times where corporations have stepped in the world of pseudo-governments and had ownerships over a very large area. One of the most famous cases took place in a small town outside of Chicago in the 1890s. It was the time of the railroad, and there were definitely a lot of railroad towns, but none quite as infamous as the town of Pullman. Founded by George Pullman of the Pullman Palace Car Company, a long-standing company at the time had basically a monopoly on producing sleeping railroad cars. So Pullman decided, what if his workers didn't have to travel to a job site? What if they lived in a town by the job site? What if he just made that town with the job site? He bought 4,000 acres south of Chicago. He hired an architect to build the plant as well as the homes for the workers. So for the very beginning, their historical records was pretty much a very true to form town and kind of like its own transgov. In fact, according to magazines at the time, Pullman was praised for all the amenities he put in a town. A man-made lake, hotels, shopping areas, multiple churches, a library, and a theater. It was noted that he wanted the employee to be free of the things that would make them become agitated or non-proficient workers, like bars or anything of that sort. And if this were a success story, it wouldn't be in this video. By 1892, things had changed. Pullman prohibited independent newspapers, his inspectors would enter people's homes with no notice, and he could terminate leases within 10 days' notice. Although there was a reverend at Pullman who wrote a first-hand experience of the turmoil of Pullman later on, the church that was built stood empty in the town due to no church wanting to pay the prices that Pullman charged for rent. In 1893, there was a large-scale recession that very much affected the railroad industry called the Panic of 1893. Many of the Pullman workers in Pullman had been out of work. However, Pullman refused to lower prices or rent on any of the buildings that he forced his workers to live in. Eventually, this led to riots called the Pullman Strike in 1894, after the recession had ended, that was named after the town, but actually had widespread across the Chicago area and even other states. It ended with federal troops ending the strikes, eventually killing 30 and wounding 57. When I was researching corporate ownership, I could not believe how closely the Pullman situation mirrored the life we would expect an Alteran resident to live like. Down to how it was ended with the federal government siding with Pullman, as there was possible linkage between the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, with possible profits from the railroad system and wanting to see it back online. If you think we learned our lesson in the past 100 years, there are towns in the United States very much dominated by one industry and usually one particular company in that industry, the newest ones being SpaceX's Starbase that bought out a large portion of a village surrounding their launch site and are currently working on establishing a municipality of their area that they have bought out, creating what would amount to a SpaceX town. So who would play the role of the federal government when we relate it back to our outer space lord, Altera? To that, we need to look at a very interesting document we find in the databanks of Subnautica called the Charter. The Charter is meant to be a full legal contract between the 37 transgovs that exist in the Subnautica universe. Although we may not have a full copy of the Charter from the databank entries, we can see bits and pieces of the principles that transgovs have to abide by. At least I really hope it isn't the full Charter, because that would be incredibly irresponsible to have 2 small sections you could copy onto a sticky note. So 1. Each transgov is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. A. Each has the right to own phase gates and planetary infrastructure. B. Each has an obligation to share phase-gate access with other transgovs on fair terms at no cost to themselves. Each has an obligation to financially maintain and comply with the TSF. 2. Each transgov has the right to self-government subject to the restrictions laid out below. A. No transgov may develop weapons and technologies outlawed in Appendix 91. B. No transgov shall engage in population abuse. That's it. That's all we got. So with the charter, in terms of substance, we have no substance. And we do have other declarations of the charter, such as the need to answer distress calls from other transgovs, as did the Sunbeam, who met its unfortunate end. While writing this section, I had a moment where I thought, should I go through this line by line? I mean, this is policy in pixels, and this is a piece of policy in a video game. I compromised. We're going to look at the two I have most thoughts on, and skip the parts that would turn this video into a 6-hour fall-asleep lecture. So let's go on to what I found most interesting. Each transgov is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberties compatible with similar liberty for others. What's incredible about this is that this is a line that is nearly a quoted line from John Rawls' 1971 A Theory of Justice, which is a very famous book on ethics and society in which his first principle of justice is quoted as, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. Alright, Subnautica story writers, I see you quoting John Rawls in your charter. Game recognizes game and you looking very familiar. It's so dumb. One thing I also noted is how this is written is it not talking about the citizens of the transgovs like Rawls meant it to. It is talking about the transgovs themselves. As I already got into the deep of corporate ownership, I will step a toe into corporate personhood, which is the idea that corporations have some rights equating to an individual personhood. There are two cases in particular that really defend corporation personhood in the United States. And again, because Altera was based on the United States, that's what we'll be focusing on. The first being Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, which is often cited as an early recognition that corporations are protected under the 14th Amendment, and Citizens versus United Federal Election Commission ruled that corporations have free speech rights in political spending. As stated, when John Rawls wrote his book, it was not referring to state, corporations, or governments, or anything above an individual person, and certainly not a corporation masquerading as a government over hundreds of planets. So we can see the increase of these rights that corporations that became trans governments got. They now have the same liberties as all individuals have, although we don't know exactly what those liberties are. As Altera was based in America, we can maybe able to assume that many are the same freedoms as modern societies. Well, maybe it's supposed to be the freedoms of modern societies. So I do plan to touch briefly on Appendix 91 as well as what we have learned through the databanks about what life is like on Altera planets. But for now, the last part I want to break down is each line has an obligation to financially maintain and comply with the TSF. But what is the TSF? How does it relate to Altera? And what can we equate it to in our world? Let's go over the Trans-System Federation. The Trans-System Federation, or the TSF, is a conglomeration and protecting body of all transgovs in the universe of Subnautica. It came into being when the 37 transgovs signed the charter into place. The TSF itself is defined in the databanks as military police charged with enforcing the terms of the charter, independent of, but funded by the transgovs. We know very little about the TSF from databanks. In fact, the only mention of them is in the databank referencing the charter and a databank profile of a certain mercenary, Marguerite Maida, that had worked with them for 15 years before being expelled from the TSF for not following direct orders. This is actually an interesting thought. Marguerite Maida never worked for Altera directly and worked for the Mongolian independent states for a few years as well. But she did work for the TSF. So what did her time there make her hate Altera so much? An interesting thought, but we need to get back on point. So we do know that they are a responsible party for enforcing the charter and are outside the jurisdiction of any one transgov. We can equate this to one real-life counterpart, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. NATO thought it was out of the woods when I talked about the UN, but nope, no one's getting away from me on this channel. For those who may not be aware, NATO is an intergovernmental military alliance created in 1949 after the end of World War II to try and avoid another global conflict, and is made up about 30 sovereign nations, much smaller than the UN, but it's only for the North Atlantic. There are many different coalitions like it on Earth, including the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the African Union, European Union, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and ANZUS. All of these being very similar to NATO, but as we established, Altera being for the United States, NATO seems like our easiest reference. However, unlike the straight shot comparison we had with the United Nations, we do have some differences between the TSF and NATO. The TSF is basically NATO, but well, if it was run by corporations instead of governments. TSF and NATO are both funded by their members, and this can cause shifts in power. Does who fund the most troops and money make the most decisions? In the TSF, this might be true, while NATO is run by consensus, and unlike the TSF that runs independently and has its own independent military force, NATO runs like a joint operation and the troops are still under their respective countries, but we'll get to that again in a touch of conflict of interest. The TSF is funded mostly by Altera. Most likely it will prioritize its main funders' issues over others, and although we don't know if that has ever happened in NATO, we can still see that there have been times where bigger countries have shaped conflicts that NATO has been a part of, including NATO being in operation in Afghanistan, mostly shaped by US-led military operations from 2001 to 2003. Then they took command of a UN-authorized mission in 2003 and ultimately withdrew alongside the United States in 2021. So to be clear, I'm not saying that NATO and the TSF are the same thing, because they are not. NATO is made up of sovereign nations, not corporations. It has policies of accountability, and those policies may not be perfect, but they seem better than the TSF. NATO and the UN do their best to keep its members accountable. It exists for the collective defense rather than the TSF that exists for the purpose of protecting the Charter and whatever its funders most likely need to use it for. The main purpose of drawing attention to the similarities is to show that in the real world and in the TSF, when you have a system where powerful entities fund the organization that is supposed to be the coordination of these entities, there are going to be tensions about influence, accountability, and who actually makes the decisions. With our world, we made policies to fight against that. With the TSF, it's like that corruption was built into the system. So we have talked about Altera's history, the policies surrounding Alterra. Now let's get into what Altera actually does nowadays and what its citizens deal with in their day-to-day lives. Altera, the corporation. We have finally made it to Altera itself. We are a very long way into the video, but it's all uphill from here. The three pillars of Altera's corporations are resource mining, infrastructure, and research and development. Although there's definitely more that happens in Altera, having tens or hundreds of planetary colonies, we can get more into that when we talk about the day-to-day life in Altera and what may happen in Subnautica too. Resource mining is something we see more happen in Below Zero after Riley has returned from his trials in Subnautica 1 and turns off the planetary defense system, allowing for Altera to go to more missions there and get what's more important than basic resources like diamonds, but knowledge. Understanding the biological data of 4546b, and as a bonus, any rare materials. The bit of the charter we get at the databank talks about the planetary phase gates and how they do belong to Altera or any transgov that builds them. Phase gates are used for travel trade and expansion of mines and outputs in various regions. Our beloved Aurora was sent to the Ariadne arm to create a phase gate before its auxiliary journey to hunt down the Degassi crew sent it to its watery grave. Altera notably holds 9% of all phase gates, and to be honest, I was surprised that it wasn't more. Between 37 different transgovs, as well as the possibility of actual governments holding the phase gates, that's not a bad number. The last pillar is research and development, and this is where we see a lot of stuff we interact with directly in the games. Things like the Seamoth, the Prawn Suit, the Sea Glide, scanners, fabricators. All of that is Altera tech, and all of it designed to help you to survive, explore, and to gather more resources. But it's not just tools. In Below Zero, we get a much closer look at Altera's research operations through Sam Ayu and the team at Phi Robotics in Station Zero. On the surface, they're studying resources and the architect rates, leading to one of the research to Alan's SOS signal, which we'll talk about a little later, along with the Kara virus research. Altera seems to have a growing pattern within its corporation. Build, colonize, research, use, rinse, and repeat. It's incredibly efficient, but what does that look like from the idea of its daily citizens? Life on the Altera worlds. There's a specific PDA found on the Grassy Plateau's wreck that goes in testimonials from Altera citizens, and of course, it sounds pretty nice. Let's look at Frank. Frank tells us about education at Altera, about how they don't need books anymore, and no one has to think about what they're supposed to do in life, and have a crisis in their mid-20s after they realize the college degree that they got is not actually remotely what they want in life and makes them miserable. However, children from a very young age are tested for their best traits and then pipelined in their respective best courses to celebrate the most efficient workers. I can't even be mad about this because at least Altera invests in youth education. Although pipelining youth into creating efficient workers is pretty dystopian. And George's story is kind of the same way. He has his own perfect habitat, kind of like a zoo animal, where he has everything within 5 minutes. He describes how his job relates to his personality. He works as a companion and describes himself as an empathetic person. And I'm not saying people shouldn't find careers that cater to their strengths. However, it shows that Altera focuses on fulfilling everyone's needs to create the best workers, to create the most efficient economy. Maxa talks about their own success story. Creating a company, writing the code for a spaceship mod for the Sea Moth, and then selling it to Altera. Fantastic, capitalism, and is now on the board of directors for Altera. It's a, I did it and you can do it too. However, everything goes to Altera, and it's a swift reminder that you are a cog in their system and nothing more, even at the very top. Jamie talks about their fantasy development and how they create what amounts to holodecks from Star Trek. The experiences are catered to people, and the big draw from this is there are people who say we spend too much time escaping our lives and not enough time making them better. Those people are from, usually, outside Altera space. This is really a double meaning. I'm sure what Jamie meant to say was Altera is already perfect. What it could actually be interpreted as, we refuse to make life better, so here's an escape for a brief moment and get back to work. Kaz says a most interesting line. There are transgovs out there that do everything with robots or where weapons are illegal, you know? So in Altera worlds, weapons are controlled and human labor is still central. And on the surface, that sounds like stability, but it also means the system depends on people continuing to be productive and staying part of that system. What happens when a person cannot participate in the system as intended? In the United States, we have Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, or Supplemental Security Income, SSI. Both give income for those with disabilities or those of low poverty level, respectively, as an oversimplification, each with their own requirements that would add hours to this video to explain the intricacies. However, from another PDA that can be found in either the Sea Treader's Path or the Wreck of the Aurora, we learn about the Altera Alms. And oh my god, can we talk about this? I absolutely lost my mind researching this. This PDA is a little unclear on how they explained it, but basically, Altera Alms is not a charity, but the closest thing to a charity we've seen from Altera. Their mission is to train unskilled workers to create skilled workers that can enter the workforce and be productive members of society. That's great. I love it. Supported employment programs are amazing. It can absolutely save people's lives and change them for better. If only that's what it was. So they get to funds from investors who enter the lottery. The more credits, the more chances to win. So the more they put in, the more lottery tickets they get. But it took me to figure out what they win, like a 50-50 fundraiser, something else donated to a gift basket. I don't know. So they actually win the worker. The now trained worker then goes under the winning investor under a contract. That is, say it with me, kids, indentured servitude. And if you said slavery, you aren't really wrong either, because we all know indentured servitude is sometimes just the watered-down version of slavery. I hate to explain this, but for those of you who may not know, indentured servitude took place all over. However, again, I'll focus on the parts that took place in America, as I believe this is where Altera got the idea from. Indentured servitude was a practice where people, usually landowners, paid for a person's transportation to America, those seeking a better life for themselves, and in return they would live under the person who played their contract and work for them for usually years. It's important to understand the atrocities that took place under indentured servitude, as it is for slavery, many people weren't actually freed after their indentured servitude was supposed to be over. There were times when people had their original 4 to 7 years servitude extended for sickness, minor infractions, pregnancy, extending it to the point where a person usually died before they were truly being free, and the courts would side with the contractor for anything. What I can see happening in Altera is exactly this. A person may not be performing to the level the company wants, the contract gets extended, sick days added back on, write-ups adding on time, and maternity leave, if Altera even has maternity leave, gets added back on. Suddenly, the Altera Alms contractor has a worker they can pay pennies for life. It's a system that worked exactly as intended when it was done before and would work again for Altera. So yeah, that's insane. Out of all the things I researched about Altera, this really took the cake. I gotta move on from this section. Let's talk about Riley and the Aurora. I won't go into much about Alterra's part of the Aurora disaster because you either played the game or you're one of those people who's obsessed with the lore and or aesthetic and just watches Let's Plays or video essays like this one. But let's talk about Riley and the famous line you get when you pick up a diamond.
Remember that materials you gather are the property of the Altera Corporation. You will be liable to reimburse the full market price. Your current bill stands at 3 million credits.
Pick up a diamond. Let's talk about an interesting prospect. Expedition item ownership. Of course, things change in survival situations, and it may not be something that actually happened to Riley that he was forced to pay back all that money to Altera, though I don't think there's a soul that would put it past them. But has this ever happened in real life? Not that I could actually find, but there are times a person may be charged for being rescued. This is often due to negligence. If you ignore warnings or require specialized rescue like a helicopter evacuation, those costs could be passed on to you, and some people even carry rescue insurance for that possibility. The state of New Hampshire is notably a state that heavily enforces this for some reason. They will absolutely bill you for a rescue if you are found to be a hiker who needs a rescue after poor planning or ignoring conditions. Switzerland has rescue service called the Rega that provide a helicopter rescue that is billed to the individual. However, you can pay for a membership which covers the cost, which is just incredibly interesting to me as someone who never leaves their house except for work and the occasional forced socialization. Let's talk about something that does make sense: expedition ownership. Like, a person who mines gold does not normally get to keep the gold and must turn it over to the company. This is also true for anything that happens in research, such as the research that happened in Below Zero, which we will get to shortly. When it comes to expedition, there's actually a pretty clear real-world precedent. In most cases, whoever funds the mission owns the results. Whether it's scientific research, resource exploration, or even private spaceflight, the data, discoveries, and materials all belong to the organization paying for it. The people doing the work, scientists, engineers, explorers, they don't usually own what they find. They're operating under contracts, and those contracts make it clear that the result go back to the company or institution. And on its own, that makes sense. But Altera takes the idea and just pushes it a step forward, because it's not just claiming ownership over discoveries, it's claiming ownership over everything. The tools you use, the materials you gather, and in Riley's case, even the things he needed to survive. So Riley crashes on an alien planet and survives against all odds, and spends his time gathering resources, building tools, and documents from everything around him. And from Altera's perspective, that all belongs to them, because he was on their mission, using their equipment, operating within their system, but at least he still got a book deal out of it. But who knows what Altera thought about him making a very public remark about Altera's biggest recent historical disaster. So, speaking of disasters, let's talk about Below Zero. The Delta Station incident and the Kara virus. Again, I don't feel the need to go over the events of Below Zero, as if you're probably far into this video essay territory, you will probably know the plot. So Altera comes back because they realize they aren't done with the planet. They come under the cover of mining, studying the planet, and researching the ancient alien race Riley found, but they have another more insidious reason. The Kara virus, a bacteria that nearly wiped out all the architects and almost got Riley, was still viable. Although Riley released the antibiotics with the baby emperor leviathans, however, one frozen leviathan still was infected by the bacterium and was studied by Sam, her girlfriend Danielle, and Vin. They ended up doing research on mutating the Kara virus and had hoped their research would lead to life-saving treatment and more widespread uses. However, I think there's a reason developers gave that small footnote of Appendix 91, and Sam also saw this. Altera was most likely using it for a weapon, and there may be a chance they succeeded despite Sam's sacrifice and the team leaving 4546B, but I don't think they left empty-handed. Let's look at the future of Altera. Although we are all patiently waiting for Subnautica 2 after some roadblocks, we are so close to early access release we can all taste the saltwater. I hope to see more in regards to Alterra, but we got some more good content from the audio miniseries Voices from Beyond, which I am about to go into, so if you do not want to get spoiled, Go watch it right now. It's 5 2 to 4 minute audio episodes that gives us amazing world building. I'll wait for you, pause me, go watch it. So, in Voices from Beyond, it gives us a family from the Mongolian independent states, and we get world building from the radio voices in the background. The third episode talks to us about an invite from Altera Corporation to participate in their seemingly new pioneer program. Their new planet is called Zizora, which was noted by a dissented anchor in the first episode of being a useless desert and just another place for Altera to colonize. There's also one other issue. The Kara virus has spread through the Mongolian independent states. Whether it is spread purposely to only the Mongolian independent states, or by accident and is now everywhere, is not yet known to us. This brings a sense of urgency to people, including the family we follow through these episodes, that takes us to the father leaving to try and get his family out by joining the Pioneer program and supposedly being lost in space. The final episode being the ship he was on nearing the Aurora and falling into the depths of a new planet in an unknown system, possibly leading to the events of Subnautica 2. I'm very excited to see what comes next and what terribleness Altera will get up to in this game. Will we see war crimes, more human rights violations? Maybe we'll see more about the other transgovs or what actual governments are up to in this world. So, that's it. Do you have any other organizations, governments, or corporations you want an episode on? Leave them in the comments below. And please, if you want to see more, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. See you next time on Policy and Pixels.